Thank you very much. Now we will go to the next item. Bear with me, members. So the next item is item 9, and it's before us there. This is the review of the 2015 parking strategy. And Auckland Council and Auckland Transport have been working jointly on this. I know media have suggested it's just Auckland Transport. It's not. It's been a collaborative effort, and it's involved Transport and Infrastructure Strategy Unit, other parts of Council and Auckland Transport. They've been working up this framework underpinning the strategy. If you could just check your mics, please. We've had a couple of workshops of the Planning Committee on this, and there's been feedback from local boards. Most of the local boards, it's been a team effort. There have been some substantial changes since we last canvassed this, members. And today we're not looking at a blanket approach as was being proposed before. We're looking to endorse a single objective, a suite of principles in 2 parts, and they are a package that was recommended by the Auckland Transport Board last week after they themselves considered it at a workshop and then at their formal board meeting. So it's forming a strategic direction that underpins the discussion document that then informs the revision of the parking strategy. It's not a strategy as yet, as many have been suggesting, but it's the first in 3 formal steps that we will take. So it's important that we consider roads as critical and public assets. They're valuable public space, and they have a range of purposes, and there's a hierarchy to those purposes. But they should be usable for all Aucklanders, not just some Aucklanders, and we should have regard to that hierarchy of use. Let's keep in mind also our declaration of a climate emergency and an agreement to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2030. And we have set a clear direction for transport change in Auckland in our strategic documents. So here we're dealing with a clear objective and principles that underpin the discussion document that will go out to Aucklanders in coming weeks. It's not yet concluded, I stress again, this strategy. So they're not going to be easy conversations, they're going to be difficult conversations, but we need to have those. And it's very important that we tell the story as fully as we can, particularly with the future in mind, and listen to Aucklanders and bring Aucklanders on that big journey that's ahead of us. So the report also asks for delegated authority to the members of this committee to endorse that discussion document to go before Aucklanders. On that note, and concluding there, I will now introduce the team that have been authoring and authorising this report. And we have with us Jenny Chatwin, the Executive General Manager, Planning and Investment at Auckland Transport. Thank you also for being on the call, Wayne Donnelly, the Deputy Chair of the Auckland Transport Board, who's been actively involved, and Hamish Bunn, Group Manager, Investment Planning at AT, Andrew McGill, who is Head of Integrated Network Planning, and Claire Kovacic, Principal Planner at AT. We also have Michael Roth, who is representing Council on this, and Michael is a lead advisor in our Growth and Strategy Unit. So now I think I will be handing to either Hamish or Jenny. Jenny, is it you or is it Hamish?
Kia ora, you got me.
We're happy to have you, Jenny.
Thank you.
And I will, just before you start, I will move the recommendations before us and the Deputy Mayor will second. Back to you, Jenny.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you, Chair. I don't think I need to say much more. I was going to do a few introductory comments, but Chair, you really nailed it. So thank you for that. We have Andrew and Claire today with us, and also our Deputy Chair, Wayne Donnelly. Andrew's going to give you a short presentation just to supplement what you've got in your paper. But essentially, this is a conversation about your endorsement of the direction you'd like us to take for the review of the parking strategy. And as the Chair has said, it's not the strategy. There's been a lot of media attention on that, I think, in the last couple of days. There'll be extensive engagement with our communities about the content and the direction of the strategy. This is about the direction you'd like us to take in at a strategic level. That's really important. I think just an interesting fact, research shows recently that over 95% of cars are parked over 95% of the time that they are used, and they're driven 5% of the time. And so that puts an enormous responsibility on the roads to look after them in terms of their parking. And it's a massive use of the road space that we frankly can use better if we're going to really address carbon emissions and congestion and have a shift to active modes. So how we use our parking assets and how we approach the strategy review is really critical. But it is a long way to go yet. There's a lot of engagement with your communities to go. And it's not today that you're saying the strategy office today, we're asking you to endorse a direction for that. So it builds on the workshop we had a couple of weeks ago, which we took a lot from. Thank you for your time for that. We really appreciated all the comments you had, and we really thought hard about where to take this. And our board has thought hard about this as well and is recommending this direction to you as something that they think is the right way to go. But at the end of the day, it's your call for Aucklanders. So I'll invite Andrew now to give us a short presentation to remind us of what this is about, and then take it from there, Chair.
Thank you, Jenny. I hope everyone can hear me. And we'll go, excellent, we'll go to slide 3, please, and I'll just call out since I'm not in charge of the slides. As Jenny said, just to sort of additionally frame this up, what we need to think about in this conversation is the way in which this is an opportunity to repurpose and think about the role that the valuable public space that is our roads and streets will play in the future, and consider that in light of the strategic transport objectives that underpin the transport system, those being creating a resilient and sustainable transport system and significantly reducing the greenhouse gas emissions it generates, accelerating and delivering travel choices for Aucklanders, reducing harm to Aucklanders and creating a safe transport system, better connecting people, places, goods and services, and enabling and supporting growth. And the role that parking can play in achieving these strategic objectives can be quite significant. Next slide. And just for context, the 2015 parking strategy has been really useful and has been able to deliver some good things. But there's 3 key reasons why we need to update it. It doesn't reflect council strategy and government policy. We've already heard today about changes coming from the government, and you'd also be aware of changes by the removal of parking minimums to the National Policy Statement on Urban Development. And of course, as the Chair mentioned before, the huge amount of change needed to respond to the climate emergency as well. It's also worth noting that the current strategy predates even the unitary plan, so it is quite overdue for a change. The other thing is we need to re-engage with the community on parking. We haven't had this conversation for quite a long time, and we need to have this conversation to hear and speak to the community about the role of roads and streets and the role of space in roads and streets, what it's going to be used for in order to achieve our goals, and also to enable the delivery of our program. We have heard very clearly from this body and developed a regional land transport plan, which is an enormous capital program to help change the transport system over the next decade. In order to deliver this program, we need to change parking as an enabler, and that goes to the question of the purpose of roads and streets. Are they places for stationary storage, or are they places for the movement of people, goods and services? Next slide. Just as a reminder, as the Chair mentioned before, we've had a session with this body back in June where we presented our approach for the parking strategy. We then went and spoke to 16 of the 21 local boards, and we also invited all local boards to give us detailed feedback on some options. We have now had a conversation in workshop with this body and also meetings with our board to look at this strategic direction endorsement, and we're now at the gold star point. And our next step is to have the public discussion document, which is going to be crafted after this session, to have the beginning of the conversation with the public on the changes. Based on the response we get from that, we will develop at the start of next year the parking strategy draft. We will be coming back to this body for a workshop and a meeting to get your endorsement on that draft for consultation. We'll do the public consultation on the parking strategy, and then we will come back to this body again to show you what the public have said and what our stakeholders have said, and bring amendments to the parking strategy for you to consider for your endorsement before they go to the AT board for approval and then public release. Next slide, and just the last bit of content and refresher. As you may recall, we are looking at 4 different components in this parking strategy review. The review of the parking strategy itself and the strategic direction of that is what we're focused on today. And there are going to be 3 sub-components that are developed. A park and ride plan for Auckland, because there's a lot of detail that needs to be developed in this area that needs to go beyond the parking strategy. The curb zone optimization framework, which is looking at the role of the curbside lane, looking at the needs of the footpath as well for that myriad of uses that we find it being called upon to be used for in the early 21st century, and also importantly the comprehensive parking management plan framework, which is the process by which we take the parking strategy and we do a detailed investigation into a specific geographic area as a precursor to developing changes to parking in that area. Next slide. Just as a reminder, and something that the chair mentioned, so I won't dwell on this, but what we heard very clearly from this committee when we met in workshop previously was that our original 3 options that we were proposing were not preferred, and that they weren't preferred because the committee very strongly felt that it was not appropriate to have a blanket approach to parking management that applied across the region, and that instead what we should be doing is have a bespoke type of parking management that aligned with the readiness and capacity of an area for change. And we heard that same piece of feedback from the AT board. So the feedback that we received from both bodies have really impacted and influenced how we have gone ahead. On the next slide, I'm not going to go through the principles themselves. They are in the paper that has been submitted to you. But I just want to say that in developing the principles and the feedback that we heard, the core things that we took as guidance was that parking management influences and impacts our strategic objectives, the 5 objectives that I mentioned before. Parking has a role to play, and how we deal with parking can impact on how we deal with other aspects of the transport and land use system and how well we achieve our objectives. That we need to consider parking in terms of the role and purpose of our roads and streets, and we need to think about, are we using our roads as they currently are for a mix of movement purposes, place purposes, and storage purposes, or are we trying to unlock and enable the mobility of the future? And also, as I mentioned just before, that different communities will have different levels of parking management. We will not have a one-size-fits-all approach, and that we are going to look at areas' readiness and capacity for change to be the focal point. On the next slide, I just want to go through in a bit more detail in terms of what we've gone through internally in thinking about this readiness for change. What we've looked at and essentially said is that first off, this will change over time. So areas grow, change and evolve, and so their level of parking management will change over time. But essentially what we're saying is areas that have the greatest public transport system in place and also have the greatest density and mix of uses are the ones where they have both of those together, the land use and the transport is right, then those are the that we believe deserve to have the greatest amount of parking management intervention, that represents that point at which parking management of a higher level and a more significant level is appropriate. And that moves down through lower levels of public transport and lower intensity of land use. And then on the next slide, what that translates to in terms of the different areas of the Auckland region, you can see. Now what we've done is we've also overlaid in red the areas that currently have paid parking. So you can see that this is quite an expansion of what we currently have. We currently have paid parking in the city centre and its fringe, a little bit in Henderson, some in Takapuna and Albany, and a little bit in Manukau. But what we're talking about here, and some in other places as well, some reactive areas, like we have some in Waiheke and some south of Hobsonville. But we're talking about having a level 3 in, this is our concept at present based on this criteria of the city centre and some of our key metro centres, Newmarket, Sylvia Park, Manukau, Henderson, New Lynn and Albany, and then level 2 parking management being around those areas that either have that high density or have the rapid transit service, but don't have both together, which would mean that they are level 3. And importantly, then level 1, the lowest level of intervention, is not about proactive parking management, but instead is about reactive parking management, as we currently do anywhere in the region where there are safety issues, where there are complaints from the public, complaints from local boards or councillors about parking problems that need to be dealt with. The other thing that's really important here is, and we are starting to articulate them, but we can't fully yet, is the Regional Land Transport Plan corridors, where these are going to be the key corridors for change and delivering on our transformed transport system, where we, in addition to parking management in geographic areas, will be looking at reallocation of road space so that a parking lane can be turned into an additional lane for travel in accordance with the strategic purpose of that road. Just finally, on the next slide is the discussion document itself. This is, as we've mentioned, the process by which we are starting that conversation. It's to articulate the need for change, explain the strategic direction that this body we hope will endorse, and explain the future processes we're going to be going through. It's going to be really important because we're doing this before we write the parking strategy. So we're going to be taking the feedback that we receive through this public engagement period to craft the policies in the parking strategy and then bring those back to the public once we've taken them again through this body early next year. So this is not going to be like a normal public consultation process where we present a sort of fait accompli draft that's fully formed. We're wanting to do this in lockstep, and that's why we've already engaged with the local boards and engaged with this body several times. So this is the rationale behind the discussion document, and we think that it will be particularly helpful in restarting that conversation and getting a good insight early on in the process. Chair, that's all I wanted to take everyone through today, and it's really just happy to take comments and questions now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. That's good. Now, is there anybody else from Auckland Transport side wanting to contribute here, and or from the Auckland Council side? I'll just pause that. There being none, members, questions from you? I don't have anything identified. Yes, I do now. I have a question from Councillor Coombe, please. Councillor Coombe.
Kia ora, Mr. Chair. Kia ora koutou, good afternoon. Thanks to the team that have brought this to us. It is really good to see how far it's come since the workshop and that so much of the feedback was taken on board. So I just want to acknowledge the the team that have done that, and also tēnā koe, Wayne. Great to have you on the call with us as well. I did send through a few questions. So Auckland Transport do know these are coming, but I would just like to highlight them if that's okay. I just have 3 questions, Mr. Chair. The first one is just around why it's proposed that the whole strategy will take potentially 10 years to implement, which seems like a really stretched implementation target. And I think it's covered in paragraph 28, because a lot of the parking management tools are needed, you know, now, like in terms of where there's pressure around stations, around fare boundary changes, around where apartments are going in, where Auckland Transport's not currently responding. So is it likely that we will see a final parking strategy that actually has implementation in, say, 1 to 3 year periods rather than a 10-year plan?
Thank you, Councillor. And Andrew, are you best placed to reply?
Yes, no problem. Thank you, Councillor. I think there's a few aspects here. The first is that where we're looking at parking changes associated with RLTP projects, for instance, the RLTP projects will occur over a 10-year period, and so therefore the changes will be made in accordance with those. So there will be changes that don't occur until year 9 or year 10, because that's when the RLTP project is planned to be delivered. So we're doing that in time with that. But I do agree with you in terms of the need to react proactively. And what we are going to try to do is set up a rolling program. First off, what we need to do is my team needs to do comprehensive parking management plans. So we're going to start, once this strategy is approved, hopefully mid next year, to do comprehensive parking management plans, starting with the city centre and working our way out. We hand those over to the parking team themselves. They do the detailed design. They will do resolutions with the TCC, and they will do community consultation as necessary, and then do implementation. But it's a question as well of resources too. So we're trying to align the program to meet the strategic needs in terms of order of priority, but we're also trying to align it with changes that Panuku are trying to implement, and also other major land use or transport changes. We just it is also a question of resources. So we hope to have this fully implemented over the course of 10 years, and you could probably expect to see, I can't promise it, but you could probably expect to see the level 3 areas done within the first, I don't know, 4 or 5 years. It's just that there is a lot of planning, design and delivery work that needs to occur.
Thank you. That just might be too late for all the areas that need parking management that are going to be intensified. Can't wait that long. But that will be, I appreciate that will be part of the consultation. The second 2 questions I have are related in terms of the financial implications that are at paragraphs 43 and 44. Is that where it says that parking revenue is 49 million, is that the net revenue? So it's not 49 million offset by the 35 million of OPEX, making it 14 million of revenue, or is that the net amount, 49 million?
Claire, are you able to clarify that one? My understanding was that it was the gross, but Claire?
Yeah, my understanding was that it was the gross as well, not offset by any operational costs.
Yeah, that's right. So therefore it, yeah.
So sorry, what was your, so therefore it is that we're only making 14 million in revenue, Auckland Transport's only making 14 million annually from parking.
No, sorry, a clarification. Oh. I'm sorry, I would need to come back to you and clarify on that.
Well, I guess the question I have is that Wellington City Council, which must be a far smaller council in terms of the parking, car parks off-street and on-street, makes 30 million revenue from parking and enforcement. So is there any assessment of why, even if that is 49 million, which is unclear, I think it's only 14 million, why Auckland Transport is not utilising our assets a bit more effectively?
Through the chair, I think that we need to make sure that we're comparing apples with apples on this one, because I'm not sure whether or not that 30 million that Wellington City Council are collecting, whether or not that's gross or net either. Right.
Well, it would be great to have some more information about that, because it kind of goes to my third question, which is around the subsidies that ratepayers are providing for parking, and the report doesn't talk to any of those costs, and I think that's what's meant by, in paragraph 43, other indirect costs associated with parking which are not quantified. But is there some analysis underway so we can actually understand the true cost of providing free parking or subsidised parking and what that's costing Aucklanders per year?
Yes, there is work underway. We're doing a whole work stream at the moment, which is looking at the direct costs associated with parking, the indirect costs and opportunity cost, and that the opportunity cost really goes to the fundamental strategic question here about what could that space be used for. And we're also looking at the costs in terms of delivering this changed parking strategy, and also the revenue, and not just costs in terms, it's not just going to be financial costs, but also resource costs as well. So we're trying to craft all that together at the moment so that we can be transparent with the public to say parking may appear free, it's actually not free. You are paying for it whether you're using it or not through your rates. And most parking is actually free, and perhaps we need to change that system from a ratepayer only model to more of a mixed user and ratepayer model like we do with public transport.
Thank you for those responses, and Mr. Chair, I'd like the opportunity to comment when that comes along. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Coombe. I will now go to Councillor Watson, please, with a question.
Yes, Andrew, you mentioned this this discussion document that's going to be used to engage with the public and win them over, or some such expression that's used there. When I read through all this, and part of my ward is one of these level 3 high level of intervention wards, what's very hard for me to visualise, and I've been to the workshops and everything, is actually what does it mean on the ground? And I know you mentioned the comprehensive parking management work that's going to happen after that, but as part of this discussion document, is there any plan in different parts of Auckland that people be familiar with as to how that could be modelled, what you're actually talking about? So in terms of, potentially clearing cars off main arterials, or increasing charges here that don't exist, or reducing the time you can park, etc., etc. Is there any plan to actually give these kind of high level concepts some down to earth applicability, so people can engage in the process with a degree of knowledge of what's driving it and what the consequences might be, potentially both positive and negative?
Back to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Councillor. It's a really good point, and we will make sure that we do some of that. I want to be very careful not to use, say, here's Smith Street, this is how it's going to look different, because that would be preempting both the strategy and the comprehensive parking management plan. But what we can definitely do is do up some concept designs that show examples of what the different management levels could look like. So we will take that away and as an action and definitely do that. I think it will be helpful in that communication.
Yes, thanks for that, Andrew, because I think even from our perspective, it'll be helpful, and I take your point about not perhaps identifying specific locations, but if it should be possible to have a degree of uniformity almost in terms of certainly those priority areas identified as to what sort of routes, what sort of situations, so people can make a lot more informed comment, because as is mentioned in the risk here, it's going to be very vital for those doing this engagement to actually try and inform and even win people over to that they can see benefits in this, and conversely for you to be open to suggestions that maybe you need to take account of, and by you I mean Auckland Transport and us. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, Councillor Watson. I think I overlooked Councillor Henderson. I'll go to Councillor Henderson now, please.
Oh, thank you, Chair. Cheers. Yeah, a couple of questions here. So now I know the street is public realm, but are staff concerned about the number of housing developments that have already sprung up with no off-street car parking and bought by people on reliance of on-street parking available?
Andrew, with you?
Yes, thank you, Councillor. I remember this is a concern that you have raised, and I do appreciate it. We are in a situation where we could see, through the changes to government policy, a situation where parking provision for residential and commercial activity is not potentially provided by the private sector and developers, but instead becomes, and hopefully this is not emotive language, but dumped on the public realm and left for Auckland Council and Auckland Transport to sort out and deal with, to the detriment of that space. And I appreciate that some of it has occurred, but we now have this very strong government signal that is going to ramp that up, and we have to send a message, I think, to developers and residents that you cannot rely on public space for private storage necessarily, because it's just not in keeping, I think, with the strategic objectives we're trying to reach. At the same time, I get that a little bit of the horse has somewhat bolted to an extent, but I'd possibly say there's a paddock full of horses. A couple have bolted, and we've still got more that have yet to leave. And if we can at least try and control that, it's better than allowing it just free rein.
Cool, thanks. Just a couple more things, Chair.
Sorry, and I'd just say I appreciate there's a variety of views on this.
Yeah, no, I understand, thanks. So a lot of parking management will touch on the placemaking role of local boards. Unfortunately, the kind of system of governance we're in, councillors carry the can and carry a lot of the blame, unfortunately, for a lot of things in this area, unfortunately. So, how are we going to involve the local boards in the process and empower them to help make the decision?
Point. So one of the... Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't wait for you, Chair.
No, that's okay.
So one of the changes we're planning to make is that, and we haven't done comprehensive parking management plans for quite a while, but as I mentioned just before, my team's going to be responsible for developing and then rolling out a program of these. And what we are going to do through the comprehensive parking management plan process is get local board involvement in those throughout their development, which the previous process is before my time, but I don't believe used to be the approach. And I think that that's fitting in terms of the fact that the CPMPs are very micro scale. They're sort of, here's what's happening on this street. And I do want to get that local input into those because oddly enough, I don't know every road in Auckland. And so I think it's fitting then that when we're actually designing and doing the detailed plan for how this town centre is going to look in terms of parking management, that the local board's brought into that process and get to have a formal role in contributing and reviewing those. So that's our plan at the moment, to sort of bring them in at that localised level through the CPMPs.
Thanks, that's wonderful. And just one last question. Thank you, Chair. Look, I've been confronted with a lot of emails last night and this morning around how appropriate it is for Auckland Transport to decide to remove parking without a requirement for consultation. So are there democracy issues involved in that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, look, what we would do in all situations, we're going to follow council's policies in terms of engagement and consultation for individual changes. And I think that perhaps this has been framed incorrectly as AT trying to take control, when what we're trying to do here is deliver at pace the transport program that has been endorsed by this body and by our board. And we are trying to do that in order to align with our strategic goals. And it is a whole, conversation that needs to happen, but we are, very keen to deliver, and we are faced with sometimes a conflict between delivering strategy and listening to what people want when the rubber hits the road on a localized level. And it is a big, tough area. But that's where we've come to with this, essentially.
Cool, thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Henderson, and thank you, Andrew. And now I will go to Councillor Cooper, please. Councillor Cooper, are you with us? We don't have audio at the moment from you.
No, sorry, it's very difficult when you've got your nexus up, sorry. So I just had a couple of questions about the recommendations, really, because I'm just wondering if they're a bit contradictory. I mean, I absolutely support that you're now looking at a staged approach, custom for each area, because a blanket approach will not work when we do not have enough RTN across the city, and we've had huge intensification in our outer suburbs with no consequent public transport backing it up. And now, where is it? Sorry, it's the part that it says, must be here. Sorry, I'm lost. Right, so it's F in the first part. It talks about parking will automatically need to be reallocated to other modes, but then in another part further down, in F of the next 3F, it says we need to take communities through the changes. So it doesn't sit right with me if you're automatically going to do it, or is that taking people through the changes before you automatically take parking away? So that's the first question.
Back to you, Andrew.
Apologies for confusion. I think what we're trying to essentially get at is that we're wanting to, in terms of, I hope I get it right, 3F, because the numbering system has changed through the development here, is that this is the purpose of the discussion document and the purpose of consultation next year on the strategy itself. We're trying to understand and gain support for the idea that if we have a road that is identified in our Future Connect network plan as being a strategic public transport route, we have problems where the buses on that route are stuck in traffic congestion. We have a project in the Regional Land Transport Plan that everyone's agreed to do a bus lane, that we don't then say, so should we keep the parking lane or should we turn it into a bus lane? That we say, well, it's been agreed by everyone that it's the strategic modal priority is buses. It's been agreed that there's a problem, and it's been agreed that the program should be to fix it, that the best and most efficient way of doing that is we can't ride in the road, so we will take the parking lane and turn it into a bus lane.
Okay, I get that now. I get where you're coming from. So the other question is, so the other one is in 2E, we're saying that Aucklanders can't rely on the public realm for longer duration storage of vehicles, and that the basically the private sector needs to provide its own parking. However, we've just spent hours debating in PSUD, which automatically takes the requirement for parking out. So, you know, where does that leave people if, you know, even with some public transport, it still won't work for everybody? And then you're saying they can't, you know, it may well be that their street ends up with no parking, but there's no bus taking them or no public transport taking them to where they work. And so what do they do? And that is the concern I have, that you know, that you really do need to work with communities to understand the needs, because I know in my area it's got the least amount of public transport and the least amount of local employment. So people have to use cars. I'm hoping we get much better at that, and we can get more local jobs, and we can get a better RTN. But at the moment we've got a proposal for a few more bus stops along the motorway. So that's my concern, is that we don't just assume, so it won't be just assumed that everybody will be able to catch public transport to where they work. When you're doing that community by community work.
Andrew.
Absolutely, Councillor.
Completely
Correct. And I think I 100% recognise and that, you know, having a bus route out the front of your house doesn't necessarily mean that it goes where you want it to go or when you want it to go. And so we can't make a decision that takes that blanket approach. We've got to be nuanced, and that's what I intend to do with the CPMP program. I think we also, this is something that we can nuance through the development of the strategy, through the development of the policies when we come to do them as well. And that will be able to be debated by this body as well once they're developed. But fundamentally, when we do this process, we are definitely going to try to, we're not going to try to, we're going to make sure that we are considering the transport needs of people in that community and people coming to that community as well. And that's why we've tried to make sure that we're aligning high levels of parking management where, for instance, you have, you know, a train station or a busway station, and you also have got, you know, a gigantic Westfield and offices all around, and it's, you know, close into the city centre, to try to mitigate that. But, you know, these are things that are definitely open for discussion by this body.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, through the chair, I'd just like to add to the points that Andrew has made, in that developing the parking strategy is our opportunity to establish and reposition the way that parking is provided in public spaces to enable the market and private individuals to understand what their role and responsibility is. So it's shifting it from, it's a repositioning of parking as to a private commodity, not a public sector obligation. And I think if we establish that, it will be helpful for the changes that we may see coming through the NPSUD.
Thank you. And I guess I'm not going to comment in the comment part, Mr. Chair, but just I guess for me it's about how we're getting so much thrown at our communities at the moment, this rapid housing intensification, way more than the unitary plan, no parking provision, and we probably will not be, a bit like Councillor Coons, we won't be able to keep up with providing the public transport or whatever it is, but so we'll still have lots of cars, because I can't see intensification slowing down in the outer suburbs. So we need to really understand that people are under a lot of pressure with huge changes, rapid changes. Thank you.
Thank you. I will now go to Councillor Walker, please.
Sure. So got a few questions, Andrew. Probably the outstanding one is around future-proofing. And my concern is if we make the assumption that the future will be 100% electric. So we're talking about electric cars, electric buses, electric micro-mobility, and almost certainly the likelihood of car sharing and the growth of operations that are Uber-like. Yes, you want an efficient roading network so that these various vehicles can use the roading network, but you also don't want the roading network cluttered, because at any given point in time you need lags and buffers. A shared vehicle needs to have some lag time and buffer time between sharing. So does any form of sharing, and that requires parking. And parking is actually a very efficient adjunct to a network in order to provide those buffers, because networks that aren't buffered aren't efficient and aren't resilient. So I've got a real concern around what that future looks like, how well it's been modelled, because I think it's a significantly different future to what we have now. And I guess the related issue is, in terms of reducing carbon emissions, the most efficient thing that we can do immediately is to actually make better use of cars so that they carry more people, and to incentivise that. And if that means providing parking to incentivise that, then that is arguably a good thing. So that's one general question. I'll just ask the other questions so that you can answer them as efficiently as you'd like. The other matter goes to this notion of public parking or private parking. In many instances, the commercial parking that's available has actually been paid for as a consequence of the consenting process. So it's been actually paid for by the developers. It might be in council ownership, but if you track back through the consenting process, you'll find that the provision of that parking in a number of instances will have been a condition of consent. So there's a contractual obligation there. I just put to you as to how well that has been thought through. And if you overlay on that the context that you've got in many parts of Auckland, where you'll have a mall or a plaza, circumstances where there's a mix of what might be called public parking, but it may have been paid for privately, and then entirely private parking, what we have to avoid is a circumstance where we have unintended consequences, where we drive people to malls where there's free parking, and we knock out our small suburban strip areas and the like, where it's council that has the influence around parking and parking charges, and we lead to circumstances that aren't carbon friendly, because what we find is that people actually have to travel further because they can't go to their local shops, because if they want to make a trip in some kind of vehicle, even a shared vehicle, it may be difficult for them to park there.
Can we come to the question on that, please?
So there is a question there. How does that work? Has that been thought through? And I guess the other question is around how we will deal with consultation and engagement against a background where our recent experience has not been a good one at locations like Queen Street and West Lynn and the like, where we've taken some parking away from businesses that has been quite vital to the sustainability of those businesses and the ability of people to shop there. So 3 questions. One, a question around future-proofing as it goes to an electric and hopefully carbon more neutral future faster. Secondly, a question around the balance between public ownership and private ownership and some contention around that. And thirdly, how we will actually consult and engage with communities, especially businesses, who depend on parking for their livelihood.
Okay, thank you. Now, Andrew, can you reply on those 3 areas that were covered, please?
Yes, I'll start with the talking about the future proofing, and I might bring in Michael Roth to assist with the consenting and local business one as well, because I think he has particular knowledge, insight, and expertise in this as well. In terms of the future proofing, I think that's really, really important, and it is a very good point, Councillor, about parking has a role, and we definitely are saying parking has a role. an important role, and not only parking, but I think increasingly what we're going to say is loading. Loading is going to be the new parking in a way in the future. We're already seeing, for instance, we've heard from courier companies during this most recent unending lockdown about how courier companies are really struggling at the moment, because instead of delivering 20 packages to a single commercial building, they're delivering a single package to every house in a street. And they're finding that really difficult logistically, and they're finding that difficult in terms of the road space allocation. And so we've heard that, and we've been thinking about, okay, yeah, so if we start to move towards more car share, more ride share, and more delivery of goods in a micro manner, we need more loading space, we need more goods delivery space, we need to think about the modes that we're using to do deliveries as well. And some companies, like there's PBT Logistics, which is already using bike couriers, for instance, that it's all pointing to curbside space being a really critical asset. And what AT needs to do is be more intentional and agile with how it allocates space to different users, because we've been engaging with courier companies, for instance, and they are telling us they don't have enough space, they don't have the right space in the right place at the right time, and that's only the beginning of the issues that we need to deal with. And so one of the sub-components that we're developing in this strategy is the curb zone optimization framework, which will go specifically to that point, and there will be a series of interventions that come out of that, and a matrix used to assess an area and identify the needs and therefore the solutions that can be implemented to assist. And these are solutions that are a little bit tactical, so they're quite quick, easy to apply. And so I think that essentially we are trying to address the concerns that you raise through this strategy. So hopefully that will assist. And as we develop more of this curb zone optimization framework, I'll be very keen to get your views and feedback on it as well. I might ask Michael if he wants to chime in.
Michael Roth. You with us, Michael?
Yes, thank you. I was going to cover some similar ground to what Andrew just mentioned. Car share operators, ride share operators, and the micro freight delivery businesses are the ones calling for more management of our parking assets. They don't want the free, unregulated parking that we have now, because they're organised, they can form agreements, whether they have a allocated spot or more of a floating model with car share. They want a managed system, so they want these changes that we're seeking. And in the context of the second question around developers providing car parking spaces, when it's on their site, that's their ownership. When it's as part of a street environment, that is not allocated specifically to parking, it is just often used for parking, there is no obligation on council or AT to enable that to always be used for parking. The idea here is to enable the space to be used for higher value uses where there are higher value uses, be they car share, ride share, loading and servicing, bus lanes, bike paths, or any other use that is deemed to take priority.
Thank you, Michael. Now I'll go to the next question, and I believe that is from Councillor Simpson. Actually, it's the Mayor. Sorry, can I go to the Mayor, please, and then Councillor Simpson?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Look, I understand there has to be a new parking strategy. It's got to take into account the goals that we have, and that ideas can be put out in a discussion document and then changed subsequently to fit the real world. But I want to just start off with a question that reiterates a concern that has been expressed by other councillors. I want, and I don't care who answers this, but I want somebody to tell me how you can sustain this outcome. The government moves legislation under urgency now to be passed by the end of the year that says multiple houses on one property no requirement for parking on the property, and 3 includes areas that are distant from public transport and from other services. And then we say, and what's more, you now can't park on the road. Now, people are going to look at that and say, yeah, we've got to change, we've got to adapt, but you are creating for people an impossible situation. And indeed, that situation probably already exists in areas like Flatbush, where you have no provision for the number of cars that are there and people are away from services. So while we talk in theory about what we're trying to achieve for parking and what are the priorities, what do you say to the person that's in the situation I've just described?
I might try to give that a go too, and it is a complex situation, as we saw in the debate that's been had the last few hours. No good outcomes, but with the NPSUD, we are removing parking minimums. We are not banning parking. We're in the position with parking now where we decide either we incentivise developers to not provide parking and to, as Andrew said, dump it on the public realm, or we try to push back and put some communications out there and some documentation that encourages developers to provide for their on-site parking needs. They will end up making the choices based on what they believe the market will pay versus the costs. I don't think it's going to be pretty, but I think we need to push. I would suggest we should be pushing back so that that extra burden does not get put onto the public realm at the same time as we're trying to work out how we can use it for higher value purposes.
Thanks, Michael. That's a frank answer, but I don't think it's going to be much consolation to the person or people that are in the position that I've described. And it will just look like government, a range of different government agencies, and we won't be separated from what central government is doing, making life hard for people who are already finding things pretty damn tough. I just think that we're creating a situation that is utterly unsustainable unless we can get some answers to what we expect people to do. Look, if you live right outside a transit station or on a major transit route, or you're in the centre of town, it's different. But we're talking about real life situations where this isn't a theoretical possibility, but a likely outcome. And I don't think we've got an answer to that yet. So anyway, my second question is, I'm really worried about 28B, where we say we're going to automatically remove parking without further consultation with local boards or anyone. That may be convenient for Auckland Transport or for somebody else. But it will look bloody arrogant to the average member of the public that says, you're taking away my parking space and I don't even have a say on it, and I don't even have any options. Democracy is about governing with the consent of the people, and I'm a little bit worried that we'll piss people off enough that they will simply revolt against this, and you won't have that consent, and you will have the situation which you've just described as being ugly. So, look, while consultation might be awkward and difficult, I don't think you can suspend consultation for those reasons. I still think you've got to consult with people so that we know that what we're doing is not creating impossible outcomes for other people. I'd like your response to that, please.
Yes, thank you, Megoff. I think, I completely take your point, and I absolutely understand that this is going to be, controversial, and that's why it's been put up, and it's for this body to consider. What we are trying to do is to find a way to deliver the guidance we have received, which is to deliver our program at pace, to achieve the strategic goals that have been set by this body and by the government to reduce emissions and deliver a transformed transport system. It's something that let's I think put it out there, and we'll see what the reaction is. The other thing is that we're not planning to just this isn't a secret plan by AT to take absolute power either. And we're not going to click our fingers, much to the annoyance of some, and have every car park in the region, paid for or removed overnight. And that's not our intention at all. It is simply about being more proactive and more intentional with our parking at a rate and level and scale that is focused on areas which have the greatest ability to absorb the most significant change. And the alternative to this, I think, is that we don't do significant change. We end up in a situation where houses all over the region have their parking needs met on the street, and we end up with an untenable situation where there are no solutions because it is far too late. That's our view on it, but it is ultimately the decision of this body about how you want to go with this. We also don't have the ability to just suspend engagement as per council policy, but what we're trying to say is there is an agreed, signed off and approved strategy that says Road X, the most strategic modal priority on this road is for buses, for instance, and to deliver this, we need to make sure that we can actually deliver it. But we're also, as I said before, not going to just storm in and do things without engaging and explaining. And that's why my perception would be that we send out this discussion document and we hear what the public say and see how things go.
Yeah, look, I understand that you're between a rock and a hard place. Engaging and explaining also needs to involve listening, and we've got to, while we have clear objectives that are easily justifiable, arterial route, it needs to be a bus lane, not a parking lane. I agree with that, but it's a process of how you talk to people, and it's a genuine, and this is really what I'd like you to make clear in your principles when you put them out. Principles are fine, but what does it mean when it's applied in practice? And I think that you have to indicate that we have a flexibility that we will listen to people and we will endeavour to find solutions to problems that we otherwise create that aren't sustainable to just load onto an individual. We do need transition, we do need time, we do need to make the changes, but a whole lot of this will depend on how we go about it and the belief by the public that this consultation is genuine rather than we're about to tell you what we're going to do and that's tough for you, but, never mind. Sorry, that's my comment rolled into my question, Mr. Chair, so I won't take a comment space on top of that. Thank you very much for the work you're doing. I know it's difficult, but please take on board some of the dilemmas that I'm setting out on behalf of ordinary people out there that feel disempowered by us making decisions about their lives that are critical without considering their point of view and how they're going to cope with a changed and different world. Thank you.
I appreciate it, and I hear your comments, definitely.
Thank you, Mayor. And we've got two-staged engagement ahead of us too. But now go to the next question, and that is from, just scroll up.
Councillor Simpson, Chair.
Councillor Simpson. Thank you, Kalinda. Councillor Simpson, please.
Oh, thanks, Chair. Look, I'll try and make my questions quite brief because I think the Mayor and Councillor Henderson have articulated mine quite clearly. Look, I've got some real concerns around this, and I haven't worked out yet whether you are consulting, i.e. telling Auckland, or really going to listen and will change your view. So what happens if you get feedback on this and it's negative?
Back to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor. Well, I mean, essentially, what we will do is we will look and see if, the feedback is such that we need to revise these. And what we would do then is present a recommendation to this body and via our board about changes. We're not, this is, this is a genuine consultation where we do want to hear what people want, there to be. And the only point I would make is that we're just, as Megoff said, in a really difficult position where the public have said, and we have been told by others, we want you to do more, and it just is then a challenge when it comes to, but you're going to do it on my street. And I don't want to dismiss that at all, because I do actually know what it is like to have this situation occur. But it is 100% our intent to listen to what everyone says when we release this discussion document, and that is why we're doing it before we write the strategy, so that the feedback we get will 100% genuinely affect what we put in our final strategy, including these final principles.
Yeah, Chair. Look, I'm sorry. I still have a few doubts around this. I absolutely support the intent, the sort of, I get where you're coming from, and I understand that it's customised for each area. But I think the risk, the closer you come to the CBD, is if you start a route doing one thing and you come into a community that say no, you can't change. You actually have to keep going. And so, to that end, in the communities that I represent, I'm very nervous about whether they will be able to be listened to, because you may have got, the buses, the trainers coming, I was going to say, which is an interesting analogy. But look, I'll just leave it there. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Simpson. Now go to Councillor Fletcher, please.
Thank you, Chair. It's a bit difficult when you come at the end of some really good questions put by others, but I want to say to Auckland Transport, I can appreciate the operational difficulties that they're operating under and their desire to send a signal to communities that you just can't take for granted that there will be parking on the street in future. But the Mayor raised some important points on sustainability. Councillor Cooper raised issues around reform fatigue. And I guess I want to explore a little bit further on the whole perception that we will be giving a mandate to you, Auckland Transport, speaking through the Chair, at the expense of our local boards and our local communities. So the questions that I've got are, how will you counter the perception that this is just a revenue gathering exercise? How will you counter the need for all of the additional enforcement? And how will you respond to the fact that we don't even have congestion charging yet legislated for? There's a lot of talk about it, and I think there's support for it, but how will you counter those sorts of things? And as Councillor Simpson has said, how do you backtrack when you've kind of started on a course? It's very difficult. So do you want to have a go at answering some of those concerns that I've got?
Thanks, Councillor. Andrew.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. And thank you, Councillor. Very good questions. I think they're quite interesting questions. In terms of the question around revenue and paying for this, our initial analysis is showing that these changes will require additional resources because we are going to be monitoring parking across a larger area, but that they will pay for themselves. We're also looking at focusing when we do parking management changes and paid parking in an area, that we can try to reinvest some of that money back into that specific local area so that you can say, well, this paid parking is actually paid for this bus lane. And what we're going to try and do as much as possible, going to the point about congestion charging, is look to align implementation of things as much as possible. It is a really difficult situation because we have all these different pieces and happening at different times. We've got changes to land use, we've got changes coming with CRL, we've got changes coming potentially with congestion pricing, and we're trying to put this in at the same time, and we're just trying to make it happen at the right time as much as possible. There's no right time to do things, but we are trying to align it as much as possible. But it is going to be complex, and you know, to get it done. I hope I've answered your question, Councillor Fletcher. If not, I'm happy to have another go.
I know you're making every endeavour to, but I guess the question being posed to me by my constituents is really within those businesses that have had difficulties through COVID, this is just not a priority for them at this time. And that issue around reform fatigue, I get it in terms of your operational difficulties, but I just feel really uncomfortable in supporting this today, because the final question I'll put to you, is this the right time? You know, could we be looking at it next year? And Mr. Chair, I won't speak to this because I think I've conveyed my sentiments on it.
Through the chair, could I please respond?
Yes.
Yes, I think they are good questions, Councillor, and that is why we have to do this in a smart way, when we have to design it well to address those concerns people have. But we also need to acknowledge the other concerns. It will always be hard to take away something that people have an expectation of getting for free, but we have the concerns of the people who want to use the bus, but it's always stuck in congestion because it can't get the lane. We have the concerns of the people who want to ride a bike, but they can't do it safely because all the sides of the roads are taken up by parked cars. And we have the concerns of the climate emergency, where we know we have to encourage more users of walking, cycling, scooters and buses. So we have multiple things that we need to address, and the change process will be difficult. But if we are going to achieve significant changes before our target date of 2030, we need to address this as soon as we possibly can.
Thank you for that, Michael. I just wonder, though, by removing, or the perception of removing the local boards in the consultation formally, is that a step too far? Ultimately, you've got to take the public with you.
Who's best to fetch that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely, Councillor Fletcher. I hear what you're saying. I just would echo Michael's point as well, that this isn't going to get any easier the longer we wait. But I absolutely hear what you're saying, and ultimately it is a decision for this body about how we go ahead with this.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Fletcher. Now go to Councillor Henderson, please.
Thank you. I'm not sure if I'm coming through. Can you hear me, Chair?
We're with you. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks. Yeah, just a quick question, and thank you for this. I've been contacted around disability parking. I was wondering if I could get staff members' comment on that, given we have just recently announced a Minister for Disabled People, which is a really, really fantastic development. And yet I worry about the effect on our disability community with this process and this plan. So if I could get you to maybe get a comment on that, that'd be great.
Andrew?
Yeah, absolutely. As the chair of AT's Accessibility Champions Group, I am 100% also concerned about this and what we've made sure in this. And we have I don't know if I can find it exactly in the paper because apologies, it's a long paper. But I think it's at the very least it will be in the appendix. Yes, increased provision for mobility parking is one of the common themes across level 1, level 2 and level 3 parking management all across the region. One of the pieces of work that Council has been doing recently as a result of the MPSUD is coming up with new arrangements for mobility parking provision for developments, because they previously relied on being a ratio of the standard parking requirements. What we're trying to do is, in the parking strategy, have a policy, and this is preempting things a little bit, but have a policy which has a formula for which we provide mobility parking. We work closely with representatives from advocacy groups, very, very closely. We meet with them monthly, and we have had a lot of success already in this space, but it's 100% a really key focus area, because for many people with accessible needs, that is their only ability to travel, and I'm 100% committed to that, and AT is committed to that as well. So we're going to make sure that if anything, we strengthen mobility parking availability through this.
Cool, thank you very much. And reserve my right to speak. I think I'm on the comments list. Thanks, Chief.
Thank you, Councillor Henderson. And I think now I'll go to the last question from Councillor Sayers. Councillor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Through you, just a couple of questions. Thank you, Andrew. At the moment, there's obviously a process. If you want to remove a car park, there must be a process that you actually follow, involving the local boards, I assume. Could you just outline the difference between the processes that are currently being used and how you anticipate the processes would change to actually, physically remove a car park where you want to?
Absolutely. And this is one of the pieces of feedback in crafting through this project, that we spoke to the parking team themselves, the people who are out and about every day. And Claire might have more info on this for me, but essentially we have a process right now where if the parking team wants to even move an on-street car park 5 metres down the road, we need to do up a design drawing. We need to then do a few weeks of public consultation and letterbox drops, and then we need to take that through and get a formal resolution of the Transport Control Committee. And so a simple thing like that, a single change to a single on-street car park, takes months. And it's something that we want to look at in terms of, is there a certain threshold perhaps that we look at below which we don't necessarily consult on, but in order to just do some faster operation here. I'm not sure, Claire, I don't know if you can speak to the role, if any, that local boards play in those operational changes to car parking.
Claire.
But if not, Councillor says what I can do, I just don't have that information to hand. I can always find that out for you and give you a subsequent follow-up which has that full detail.
Okay, well, I'll just assume that the local boards are in the loop somewhere, but I might be wrong. So just around this, is that clause 28B again, which I just want to reflect on, is that, so going forward, what, say resident, or even a ratepayer's home, their ability to have input into that sounds like, if it's not going through the local board, what that process of you've just described with the designs, the letter drop, the public engagement, that wouldn't occur either, Andrew. Am I correct on that assumption?
I think there's a few things here. So at the moment, that is correct, that the process is that, as someone in that street, they would be consulted on that change. Under the new approach, there's two different things that we're talking about. One is general area parking management, which is the sort of green coloured map, and which would be involving local boards, and we would have to look at, we haven't developed these policies yet, so I don't want to preempt anything too much, but you know, we haven't yet determined what that public consultation would be on that. All we've come to is we really need to make sure we get the local boards involved in this. So I can't speak to, because it just hasn't been developed yet, what that new approach would be. All I'm saying is the feedback is that from the parking team that they spend so much of their time consulting on shifting a park 5 metres down the road that, you know, they could do 2 park movements a year instead of 1 if they didn't have to do this. It's an entirely separate thing from the broader position that we're asking the body to consider, which is that for roads where we need to remove parking lanes to provide for strategic modal priorities, that we don't do consultation. So I hope that clarifies it. But
sorry, Andrew, I'm back here.
Oh, thank you, Claire.
Chair, I'd be happy to answer that. Sorry, I'm having terrible Skype issues. We have an obligation to consult with local boards, but there are different ways of consulting. So there is a public consultation spectrum, the IAPT spectrum, and there are varying degrees to which you consult. So if it's something where you want feedback and you can enable change, or the feedback can enable change, then you would consult with the expectation that change could happen as a result of that consultation. There's also a part of the spectrum where it's more aligned with informing than consulting. And if we were to get the mandate to clear parking from a strategic movement networks, it would be more along the lines of the inform part of the spectrum. And that's not to say that we would disregard any feedback, because there potentially are mitigation measures. Not every strategic network where there is parking would require parking removal. It may be inset, it may not be required to be removed. So it's very project specific, and we would absolutely need to be engaging with local boards and are bound to by legislation.
Oh, thank you very much, Claire. And Andrew, thank you very much for your comprehensive answer. It was helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, if I could just reserve my right to speak when we get to the comments and debating section. Thank you.
Certainly, Councillor Sayers. And that concludes our questions. And I echo the acknowledgement of you, Andrew, and the balance of your team at Auckland Transport, together with Michael Roth at Auckland Council. It's been a big team working on this. While it's been identified as an Auckland Transport strategy, this is really an Auckland Council and Auckland Transport strategy. So thank you. We appreciate your the work that you've put into this. It's been over some period now, but it's still very early stages and we've got a long way to go. So I want to thank you and we will allow you to step away from the so-called virtual table. And we'll go into debate shortly. But members, if we can just go to the extension of time motion before us, can I have a second to that, please? And it'll be to the completion of our business. Do I have a second, please?
I'll second. Dalton.
Councillor Dalton, thank you. All those in favour say aye. Aye.
Aye. Aye.
To the contrary, no. And declare that carried. Can we go back to the... I declare that carried. Can we go back to the motion before us, please? I just want to make sure that members are fully aware of the motion. There are some refinements to that motion. The A, if we could just go to the A again, please, Kalinda. So it's just reinforcing that the objective and the strategic directions, the principles, I should say, are for the purposes of underpinning the development of the strategy. Okay, so there's a long way to go. So it's to ignite the conversation, and as has been highlighted, it is two-stage engagement with the communities of Auckland. The first is the discussion document. Can we scroll down now again, please, Kalinda? And members, this hasn't been on the screen, and this is the disadvantage of our electronic meetings. So I'll just make sure that you have time to read that, because we're voting on that. And this, I believe, reflects many of the points of concern that have been raised, and I've, along with staff, have tried to capture that and articulate it in those 3 refinements. Okay, so that's what's before us. And just speaking to this, members, one thing that I find I'm really encouraged by actually is a number of speakers today or council members have raised in their questions this recognising the value of road space as public space. It's quite refreshing to hear that, and I've always thought so, and it's good to hear that getting some traction, and it's so true, but it does beg the question why we haven't managed our roads, the public road space, as treasured public space, like a park, for example. We don't allow that to be colonised by certain activities. And public space that contributes to council's agreed strategic objectives, everything that we've signed up to, that's where we need to be focusing in ensuring that those strategic objectives are delivered upon first. And first up, paramount to that is road safety. For example, delivering speed limits and safer speed limits. And then we need to support mode shift in favour of public transport and walking and cycling, and high occupancy private vehicle use as well. Let's not forget that. That's on the radar. And we always need to make sure that we're addressing the freight demands and making way for freight connections. Let's think of the landscape opportunity, the carbon sink opportunities of the greening of trees and gardens in that road space, and how we can become a sponge city through water retention and treatment in the road space. We need to do a lot more of that, and we need to use that road space more efficiently and effectively. And let's not forget the public realm that can be created through the road space. Shared spaces, places for people, to gather, socialise, enjoy. I guess it reminds me of that word parklet rather than maybe just parking. But, over time, most of those outcomes, have been difficult to sign up to. We acknowledge that those strategic priorities are the direction Auckland needs to be tracking in, except we've not given much real heed over the last few decades to making it very clear that they are the priority. We've sort of found ourselves defeated by the call to set aside public road space for privatised space, for car storage. That has won the day. And there's been a call for that to be forever, as of right, and free and uncontrolled. But it's also understandable because for decades, probably as many as 60 years, that's become entrenched. It's become the norm. But we all know that there's a whole new normal ahead of us. So we need to begin shifting gears to shift mode and shift modal choice. So this paper just begins the discussion. We've workshopped this. Our local boards have been included and their viewpoints have been embraced, and you can see that in this paper. And we've got a long way to go, but we do need to make better use of that valuable and finite public road space. And we're not concluding anything today, we're just embarking on that conversation. But to date, the conversation has been dominated by, what could be lost rather than what could be gained. So maybe we need to balance that up a bit in the weeks and months ahead with a different picture of the future. Maybe some opportunity beckons here. It's not all about loss. For me, one thing's for certain though, we cannot keep widening roads at the great financial, environmental and social cost, severing communities as we widen roads. And there's cultural cost in there, I'm sure too. But when we know that we can't keep doing that, when we know that the existing road space can be far better utilised and far more efficiently operated and at much lower cost. So this is a confronting conversation we're going to be having, no doubt, but it is time. We also responded to the climate emergency that's been mentioned here today, as well as our unprecedented population growth. It is just utterly vital that we are are proactive in addressing the strategic priority needs of Auckland in the road space. So Auckland's eyes are on us today in the coming months, but so too are international eyes, because this is the first week of COP26. So let's remember this week in that context as well. So car storage has been prioritised in the past, but this can't be the case over the arterial roads of Auckland going forward. And we do need to reduce emissions and create a whole new era of mobility, one that's not carbon generating to the extent it is now, and definitely not a gridlocked one. But this paper, it doesn't purport to ban curbside parking all over Auckland, far from it. It just identifies it as a lesser priority to those high-level strategic needs that I've articulated. So they're the public transport, the freight, the cycling, and the high occupancy vehicles. And it will apply primarily in the city centre, metro centres, and those major arterials. It's not a blanket consideration. So the public discussion document's the first part. It's framed up with that objective and a suite of principles. It kicks it off, and we will have a two-stage engagement with communities. And then that moves through. We'll take lessons from that. After the formal consultation, the draft parking strategy will be worked up, and then ultimately the final parking strategy in June, and hopefully that is ripe and fit for the future. So there's great opportunity here. There's an opportunity to collectively rethink what our streets could look like and explore possibility. So we need to make sure that, you know, the movement of people and goods is efficient and safe and reliable. And let's look at how we can create some really great streets for people. And finally, members, this really struck a really nice chord when I heard somebody on media last night, a young woman, a young Aucklander, say to media, she wants to see a city that's more of a joy to get around. And I totally concur with that viewpoint. I'll now go to the Deputy Mayor.
Thanks very much, Chair Chris. And thanks to the Wayne and your board, Wayne at AT. Thanks to Jenny, Alistair, and for Michael at our place of work. Is like it's been said, the Mayor explained it very well. This is going to be challenging for a lot of people, but change is upon us. We're going to be in a new COVID world, and transportation, if we're going to decongest, is not going to be about cars outside every home. We need to get fluid mobility. We can't create more road space by leaving things the same. We need to get safe places for bikes, for walking. We need to get safe places for the buses to get guaranteed time of travel. I heard what Councillor Walker said about, you know, people doubling up in a car. Well, it's going to be part of the congestion issue as well, isn't it? And we're going to have that might be part of the solution. And a road pricing system introduced early will help maybe deliver some of that stuff. But let's go and have this conversation with the public and be prepared for some pretty big hits, because the people won't like it. A lot of people won't like it. You know, when the Mayor mentioned Botany, you know, there's a perfect case in point, where there is just ribbons of cars each side of the road every morning and every night. We have to get away from that. We can't survive that. The Chair brought up COP happening right now, COP26. We're signing up for some big issues, and that means each and every one of us has to do something, and some of us do a lot. There's no one person, no one industry, no one simple solution. Everyone is going to face the challenge if we are going to keep our emissions below what we have promised to do by 2030 and 2050. None of it's going to be easy, and the amount of change and the pace of change is going to escalate. The talk about the intensification that's been signalled through the government's work, and now there's 3+3 on top of that, also adding challenges and pressures. And we need to get a better understanding exactly of what the government thinks around what is deliverable in this space. And we've got a new development being proposed down at Takanini, right next door to Ardmore Airport, which is not going to have any garaging. It's going to be 5,000 homes there. And your car, if you do have one, will be in a limited parking space by the community centre or community hub area. And this is going to be fast-track consenting through the government's new processes. So, yeah, we are facing a different world, and to remain relevant in it, we as council need to move with speed and agility and to be in front of the game. And yes, this might take a bit of time to deliver, but once it starts to gain some space, Councillor Coombe, and gain some pace, it will actually make a difference. So I'm encouraging everyone to support it. Not to do so is actually reneging on your responsibilities, I say. And that would be a shame, because we'll hear from our public, and we will hear in volume from some, but there will be a different discourse as the time goes on. So thank you, Mr. Chair, for letting me second this motion. Thank you, Michael, for the briefing we had the other day on it and sharing other options and visions for the future going forward. I really enjoyed that. And well done, Wayne and the board, for pushing for this. There's work that needs to be done, because we cannot create additional roading space in our urban areas. It's just too damn hard. Only way forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. I'll now take the call of Councillor Henderson, please.
Thank you, Chair. I've got my small son in the background if you hear anything. But look, I want to just briefly say a few things. I want to acknowledge the improvement to the draft recommendations. I think that's a good move. I have the same concerns as Councillor Cooper, that there's a concern that communities are being asked to accept large amounts of change in a short time. And we've personally seen the pressure people are under in this issue recently. And we kind of have to acknowledge that in our rohe. Also, regarding the Mayor's concerns, I share those as well. Look, you really can't suspend consultation with people. I think there's really a democracy issue there. And otherwise, how would you know what problems you might be creating with the change? So I think there's no shame and nothing to hide from in consulting people. We should just learn more. And also that the theoretical situation the Mayor describes as a real one in places like Flatbush, I understand, but also places like Westgate and Te Autū Peninsula. And if you'll forgive me, colleagues, for talking about my ward, I do want to talk briefly about Te Autū Peninsula, because it's a good case study where a lot of people were sold their homes with advertising actually telling people they have on-street parking available, which I think is completely unethical. And it's created really dangerous situations on some of those streets. And so I'm really worried that AT, if you're looking kind of a broader level around the parking stuff, I'm worried that AT haven't got the agility in the organisation to meet safety issues quickly like this and actually address things quickly. I've met with people pre-COVID on their doorsteps and on street corners in Te Autū around this issue, and they do have legitimate concerns. So I'm really glad that we're going out there and consulting with them and hearing from them personally around some of the problems in their streets that have been created. I'll note, of course, the elephant in the room is climate change and mode shift. And I've said a few times that, you know, obviously we have one agenda item in all these meetings, and that's climate change and securing the future of our city for our kids. And that's going to need bold action. But at the same time, we do need to bring communities with us for results that are going to work and are actually going to endure. Therefore, look, I'm really happy to note that we're consulting communities on this, and I expect there's going to be concerns that we'll need to meet. But let's try and bring our community along with us when we're trying to plan and change for the desperate things that are needed to resolve our climate change issues. Let's hold hands with them and meet our climate issues together as best we can. So thank you, and I really look forward to reading the submissions and hearing more from the community about this. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Henderson. I will now pass to Councillor Coombe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to speak in support of the recommendations. I really do like talking parking, as it's an issue that I've taken a keen interest in since I was first elected 11 years ago, because if we can get parking strategy right, it really is the biggest lever that we have for change, and it has implications right across our urban design, our planning and our transport system. It has really big implications, and I really love parking too, because you can take an evidence-based approach to it, but it also makes it a really emotive topic, because we all have personal experiences of parking or parking issues. But what I'm really pleased to see is that what has been brought to us, the objectives and principles to go out for consultation. And it's really important to note that this is just setting the groundwork for the consultation. We're not signing off on the strategy. But what has been brought to us is based in evidence, and it's also recognising the opportunities that are here for Aucklanders if we get parking management right and if we set the right strategies and principles going forward. So I do really appreciate the work that's been put into bringing this to us, and also that the AT board have actually done the hard work, because they're recommending this package to us. We're just being asked to endorse it. The hard work has already been done in terms of the way forward. So I'm very happy to endorse this approach. And there's a few comments that I want to make. First of all, in terms of this being framed as a war on cars, which I just find is almost laughable, because the cars are actually fine. 2/3 of our transport budget goes to roading and cars. Our cars are finding the ability, drivers are finding the ability to park their cars all over Auckland. And if you come into the city centre, even during lockdown, you'll find that parked cars have taken over a lot of our public spaces, including shared spaces. Cars are parking on our berms all over the place, even where there is off-street parking. So, we don't have to worry about cars in our city, but what we can do is reframe this, that this is actually a strategy that is pro-driving. It helps drivers if we ensure that arterials are flowing freely. It helps business if freight can get around, if there are loading zones. It's pro-equity if we can ensure that the city is moving effectively and people who need to get around are getting around. It's pro-city building. It's pro-good city design. And most importantly, this is pro-children. Children who don't drive but actually want to be able to walk and cycle to school safely, use public transport. And it's also pro-accessibility, because actually car-orientated infrastructure is often really inaccessible. So this is all about making arterials work far more effectively for everybody, and also noting that 30% of Aucklanders don't actually drive. So, we can really put this as a way of saying that to not have effective car parking management is actually anti-community. So I'm really keen for us to move ahead with this pro-community approach to parking. Another comment I've read is that this is in some way a radical plan. Now, I'd like to just remind members that there's already a parking strategy, and in that parking strategy that was signed off 6 years ago now, and you could actually say that that was radical back 6 years ago, but that's when the AT board didn't have to bring this anywhere near politicians. They were able to do this just taking an evidence-based approach. And do you know that in the parking strategy at the moment, it says AT will manage parking on arterial roads by extending clearways or removing parking where it inhibits the capacity of the road to carry more people, particularly in the peak periods, or causes significant delays to the speed and reliability of public transport, or causes safety risks for cycling, or impedes quality improvements on the Auckland cycle network. So it's already there. This is give away public space for free in a climate emergency, and for us to be allowing a very few parked cars to be impeding the movement of those in public transport. And although also the people who just want to get around safely. So I do want to just emphasise that this is a significant benefit for drivers if we get this right. And this is where I just want to make a comment around bringing the community along, which I understand everybody is thinking about that. What does this mean for their ward? How do they bring their community along with this consultation? And I want to give some examples of this, how the community has come along since that first parking strategy 6 years ago. And I was really on the front line of the first wave of parking permits for St Mary's Bay, and this is actually going back before the parking strategy, but it was incorporated into the strategy around residential parking permits. And I was met with outraged public meetings and pushback from the community who could not believe that they would have to pay $70 for a parking permit to park in their street. Now, that scheme, that whole residence parking scheme that's embedded in the parking strategy is now covers all of the central suburbs, the city fringe suburbs, pretty much. It's being rolled out in the last 10 years, and it is working really effectively. And the majority of residents would just not go back to the way it was, where it was a free-for-all, where there was so-called free parking, but you couldn't get access into your house. And it was also setting a false sense that commuters could come in and park and hide and then walk into the city centre or catch the bus. And we've also brought people along in terms of those commuters who were using the free public parking, on-street parking, to park all around suburbs near town centres like Ponsonby, and particularly, say, people coming in from the west who are like, you have to keep those car parks because they can't park anywhere else and they can't use public transport. Well, there are now those public transport network links coming in from the west. There is a bus that now connects from Kingston Station into Ponsonby Road. So all of those commuters who used to park for free, they've had to change their habits, but they've been provided the service to do it. Our business associations have come along when they were showed the evidence and that it helps business to have a high turnover of parking. They really embraced it. When they're presented the evidence about how they can help get freight moving around Auckland, they really embrace this approach because it helps business. This is a pro-business parking strategy. There's also just the use about how we bring the people along in terms of how we use the public domain. And I understand that 85% of homes have off-street parking, but there's an issue that a lot of people are now filling their garages with their filling up their garages and not actually using their garages for their vehicles. But that's the conversation we have to have, that is the purpose, to be able to park off the street. I do have a few more comments I would like to make, Mr. Chair, just in wrapping up. And I'm just going to keep going because I do feel that I would like to be able to make these comments. I've mentioned about the benefits to drivers and bringing drivers along. Just for example, like on Newton Road, where there are 4 car parks that block the evening traffic every evening, which is it's just crazy that Auckland Transport just hasn't removed those car parks from an arterial. So that's a real reason why we just need to. Thank you, Councillor Henderson has just moved an extension of time. So may I keep going, Chair?
We don't need the extension of time, but if you could conclude soon.
Okay, I do. There's just a couple more things that I really feel that need to be said because they've come up in the debate. Just about I've heard that the MPSUD is a reason for us to slow this down and that there's too much change coming and that we're in some way making life harder for Aucklanders, or we're creating this situation or creating a problem. Well, actually, we're going to make it far worse for Aucklanders if we don't put in place an effective parking strategy now so that we can respond proactively to the change that's coming to our suburbs. And we're already seeing that where there's a lot of pressure on our public streets, on our arterials, because we haven't set that clear direction around how development's going to happen and how we're going to respond to that growth. So we absolutely have to get this in place now so that the planning's there and that we send a really clear message to the market so that the market knows that we will be using arterials for prioritising it differently away from the storage of cars. And I know that that's different for the people who've been caught in the middle, who might not have been sent that message, but I get that as well, like in the city fringe where apartments are going up and people come to me and they say they want their parking permit, and I'm like, This has been signalled to you since 2015 that if you are in an apartment built since 2015, you are not eligible for a permit. And it's the same on Great North Road and all of those roads that are in Future Connect. It's been signalled for years and years that they are arterials that are going to be prioritised for public transport and active modes and placemaking. So that's why we've really got to get this in place now, and we can't wait. And that's, this is, yes, the NPS's UD is being done to us in a certain way, but this is something that we can respond in a really positive way. And just another comment I just heard was about Councillor Walker always likes to throw in a bit of facts about my ward, which are not correct, and that's with the Westland, the local shops there. The project there, upgrade there and the cycle lanes there, did not actually remove any parking. It was a net gain of parking. And local shops can actually benefit from making them more accessible places. So I'm just going to wrap up. I just want to acknowledge the local board feedback, and it's interesting to read, like, say, the Orake local board, who really get the bigger picture, and they said that we have to reference the NPS UD and our climate, and that this has to be a climate response. So, they really got it in terms of the bigger picture, whereas I can understand with local boards, wanting to get down into the operational matters of parking. But we have to take this as the bigger picture. I know it's an emotive issue, but this is an opportunity for us to take an evidence-based approach. So none of us around this table are experts, so I leave it with the experts, and I really look forward to the discussion that we're going to have. So thank you for the indulgence. I really, as you can tell, enjoy talking about parking and appreciate this opportunity. Ngā mihi nui.
Thank you, Councillor. I will now take the call of Councillor Watson, please.
I guess if those three lines that were quoted from Councillor Coombe are in the 2015 strategy, I just really wonder what a lot of the fuss is about, because they seem to me to encapsulate in three lines the essential reasonableness of keeping arterials open for traffic flow, for bus use and for safety. I doubt if there'd be too many people that would disagree with that. So if that's been in there for 6 years and it hasn't been able to be enacted where appropriate, you just wonder if that's more to do with the action side of things rather than any strategies or policy documents sitting in cupboards. I guess, Mr. Chair, when I read through this particular paper, it is very high level, and and it follows a whole series of articles yesterday in the paper, painting this the proposed changes as being sort of car unfriendly, if I could put it euphemistically like that. But if you go to point 45, the comments made that the proposed changes to the parking strategy have an emphasis on more controls, higher prices, reduced supply, along with greater enforcement. I would suggest to you, if you're looking to win people over or take the community along with you, that combination of factors, controls, higher prices, reduced supply, and greater enforcement, isn't going to be the winning trifecta. Anything but. And if you're talking about winning the public over and understanding their position, I think a lot of people in the public would be a little bit confused, and potentially to the central role parking seems to be getting placed in terms of our climate change response. If we're talking about cars, it was James Shaw, the Minister, in fact, just earlier this year in June, talking at the release of the Climate Change Commissioner's final advice, he talked about a future which cars, and Rod Car was the same, figured quite prominently in terms of a future that cars being charged overnight by renewables, people travelling to work in more efficient cars powered by cleaner fuels, praising the incentivising uptake of low emission vehicles and the cost savings to people fortunate enough to be able to actually purchase those vehicles. So at some point, you would think there's going to be a bit of a revolution in cars, and those cars, one will assume, will be entirely compatible with climate change objectives and reducing emissions. Now, I didn't see that kind of referenced anywhere in our document, but obviously such cars, and if they come in big numbers, will need parking. And if we're talking about winning people over and indeed getting communities on side, I think we're perhaps underestimating the amount of work that's to be done, because pretty much about the same time as James Shaw was talking, there was the release of the IPCC latest International Panel on Climate Change, which painted a pretty devastating picture of unprecedented climate change in terms of the last 1,000 years. At the same time as that came out, the car figures for new purchases in New Zealand came out, which showed that New Zealanders are driving bigger cars, travelling greater distances, and emitting more carbon dioxide as they go. And the top 4 most popular new passenger cars last year were all SUVs. So in terms of winning people over to parking enforcement that may be perceived as being unfair or punitive, in terms of drawing the dots with climate change and obligations and what's happening in Glasgow at the moment, I think there's a lot of work to be done. Those figures show that by the actual car sales. As far as this particular suite of proposals goes, it's actually quite hard for people in the outer areas really to go to their communities with too much assurance, and that comes on the basis of things that have happened in the past. Now, I can see any number of arterials that I travel around, and they should be cleared. That they are 1 or 2 cars positioned in the wrong place can essentially take out the flow and the use of a lane. Now, I don't think anyone's going to argue about that, but beyond that, if we're talking about other charges and regimes, they might even be counterproductive. If it's all about reducing vehicle kilometres travelled, which as I understand that it is in terms of reducing individual carbon footprints, then surely anything that feeds into reducing that, certainly in an initial period, isn't that what should be encouraging people to do? So by virtue of the people that travel to park and rides, for instance, they're saving vehicle kilometres travelled straight away, because only part of their journey, and sometimes maybe anywhere from a third to a quarter, is actually using a vehicle, whereas anyone else, it's 100%. Similarly, from people that opt to maybe use public transport on 1 or 2 days a week instead of all 5, they are straight away clicking that carbon saving footprint immediately. They're not waiting for almost punitive regimes to kick in that are hard to actually connect to the central message of getting people to reduce the kilometres they're travelling. In some instances, travelling to your local shops is far more preferable to travelling to the big Westfield supermarket. So I think this is a little bit more nuanced than we're giving people credit for in terms of public perception. It needs to be wedded in to the bigger climate change impetus, or hope will be impetus, and we perhaps can use some of these examples from overseas. If we're talking about parking strategies, Glasgow City had their own strategic parking review, which looked to do a number of things we were doing, but which predicated their changes in terms of parking on a significant step change in the level and quality of PT transport provision, patronage and integration, a significant step change. Now, I don't know if we're signalling that along with this. That's what they did, and that's from a city that has one of the densest heavy rail networks in the UK, and is certainly leading the charge in climate change. Their parking as such around their region basically had a cap on it, which as your population goes up ends up being essentially a reduction, because the population grows but the parking stays the same. So I think we've got a bit to go on this, Mr. Chair. I think there will be people quite understandably have reservations, and I must admit I'm one of them. I have to wait for the specifics to come to see how the interest of small business people are taken account of here. Whether some of the changes proposed, like happened with us with Oteo Valley Road, which is the most busy arterial in our ward, where it was suddenly reduced to one lane just coming out of COVID last year with disastrous results. Now, if that sort of dictate can be applied to some similar situation with this program, then I would have real concerns. So I certainly share the Mayor's view that the fundamental democratic principle of engagement, and perhaps it might be a fast-tracked engagement, has to really occur with the people that are effective, because we don't know everything. There are things communities know that we don't know. And as we say in this very paper, there's a huge diversity across Auckland as a whole. So I'm cautious with this. I can see the logic, certainly in terms of the use of arterials and ensuring any number of these other benefits flow. But I think people are understandably suspicious, and there's a long way to go to win the public over. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. I'll now go to, I think it's Councillor Dalton. Councillor Dalton, your call, please.
Thank you, Chair. Look, I'm going to support this. I think what's really important, and perhaps the shift, and I'd like to thank Wayne and the Board of Auckland Transport, as well as the officers from Auckland Transport on all of this work, to go out with a discussion document first, to have those conversations before pulling the strategy together for consultation is really important. And what we talk about in the Transport Emissions Reduction Group is how we do tell our why, our story, what it all means, so we can take everyone along this journey with us, because it's a long journey. And there's a lot of people in my ward that if I said COP26 to them, it's going to mean something completely different to what's happening in Glasgow right now. But if there is a reason why we need to get to a point and they can understand what that reason is, it is respectful of them as participants, as Aucklanders, in a democracy where they possibly don't feel like they have a voice. And I've read the commentary too, where Auckland Transport's already made up their mind. Why are they bothering to consult? I think the discussion document is a good step forward into getting out to get the evidence. And Councillor Coombs talked about evidence. Evidence is more than what we gather from the number of people taking hop rides, bus rides, train rides, ferry trips, and it's more than the projections that we need to do to see where we're going to reach our emission targets and how we'll get there. The evidence is about speaking with Aucklanders, because, as Councillor Watson just said, it's diverse. What people are putting in their garages is not their cars, it's their family. Their cars are going on their front lawn as well as the road corridor. So this is complex. And that is in some parts of Auckland, not in all parts of Auckland, but I'm driving down main roads in my ward, and families are living in the garages. That's why the cars aren't in there. So we've got a long way to go, and I think what's important is that we can articulate a time frame. There'll be a fear that all of a sudden you can't park on the road. And the fear is real because we have other pieces of policy and legislation coming through, like enabling the intensification, like removing the minimum parking. That all is a reason for people to wonder where they might be able to park their car, and the right, and I think a lot of people, including me, thought I had every entitlement to park on the road outside my house. It's not actually an entitlement. This is a public space, and perhaps you might need to pay for that public space one day. So a lot of information to be parted out to the people of Auckland, and an opportunity for them to really have an understanding of where we're going and why we're going, including the governments and targets. That's the story, isn't it? Where it's about climate change and how we're going to get multimodal transport going, and the reasons why that is important and why it has to happen. There's a good reason behind everything, then people get in behind it. And if there's one thing that the vaccination program has taught us, I hope, is that we have lots of different ways to reach people who are not engaged. And they're not engaged because things just aren't a priority. But this has to be. Climate change has to be a priority for everyone and their children and their grandchildren in the future. So I support, what I'm supporting the most about this, Chair, is the methodology of going out with a discussion document, getting some meaningful feedback before a strategy is developed, and then going out and consulting on a strategy. So let's take our time and do it right. Thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Councillor Dalton. I will now hear from Councillor Newman, who's back with us. Welcome back, Councillor Newman.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Look, I'm sorry I wasn't here for all of the discussion previously, but I'd read the paper and I've been thinking about this in recent days. And look, Chair, I am very enthusiastic about clearing parked cars off the Great South Road in my ward and off arterial corridors elsewhere, because I don't believe the road corridor is necessarily private space. Actually, Chair, I've tried for years to persuade Auckland Transport to take on-street parking off the Great South Road in Takanini. I don't want the cars off the road for a cycle lane. The cycle lane needs to be a shared path with pedestrians. But the real estate on the Great South Road needs to be there for a bus and a carpool lane. Auckland Transport doesn't actually have the funding to deliver the contracted bus services, but they need to. Of course, the carpooling is very important there too. And so we need to be able to have these arterial corridors to get people moving, not to privatise the public realm, so that people can externalise their footprint beyond their property boundary. People need to use the full property boundary that they have, but also limit their effects beyond it. Chair, what is important, however, is the need to balance this discussion. Whilst I might be willing to displace vehicles off the arterial corridors, I'm not necessarily willing to sign up to a process that displaces cars off side streets. And, we need to ensure that disabled people can drive and they can park up. And Auckland Transport is a CCO, but it is also a road controlling authority, and it needs to not act in isolation. Local boards know their communities, and there will need to be a balanced approach to this. I think that, one of the unintended consequences of this, I'm sure, is that developers will look at this, and certainly the context of the NPS, and that is a relevant discussion. You watch, as we displace cars from streets, the value of off-street parking is going to increase dramatically. You watch developers enjoy that windfall. Councillor Coombe, watch the auction prices for the car parks go up and up and up. And I listened to the challenges faced by the good folk of St Mary's Bay, and God bless the good folk of St Mary's Bay. But Councillor Coombe, next year come with me to Addison. Come and see the properties in Addison. And yes, there are families in the garages in Addison. And the cars are parked not in the driveways, not in the garages. They are parked on the berms and the reserves everywhere in Addison. I make these comments in the context, Chair, of my willingness to vote for this to be part of a broader discussion. And there's no doubt, Chair, that there are residents who will respond to this. And I've come to the conclusion that those residents loathe at the council, and they really, really, really loathe Auckland Transport. And much of the feedback, I am sure, unfortunately, will be another manifestation, you know, of bloody council coming up with yet another way to make our lives miserable. Now, that might be an unfair summation, but that's how they'll view it. This is going to happen. I made the comment to Councillor Henderson offline before that the landscape in 2021 is very different to the landscape in 2020. And Councillor Watson is right in his interpretation of Minister Shaw's acknowledgement that the future role of low emission vehicles is going to be significant, very significant, in contributing to a net reduction in emissions. So nobody should sit around this table and view elected members as lacking for courage. Nobody around this council lacks for courage, but nobody around this table should have a tin ear. We cannot discard critical and challenging feedback. And finally, Chair, can I just say that I respect the views of Auckland Transport's officers and consultants and the board, but, you know, Auckland Transport is a CCO, and elected members can't be vassals of the CCO. We need to be elected members who ultimately set the parameters for planning within which Auckland Transport needs to respond. And the basis for our decision making needs to be balanced on both the advice we receive as well as responding to the community's expectations. So I look forward to listening to some pretty challenging feedback from the public, which will count, certainly from my perspective, in determining you know, my view on this matter as the discussion evolves. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. I will now take the call of Councillor Walker, I think it is. Yes, Councillor Walker.
Sure. So I'll make some brief comments, Mr. Chair. On the face of it, these various principles look okay, but it's a very confused situation because we're talking about a parking strategy, yet we're voting through some principles. We're going to be going out with a discussion document. I'm assuming that the discussion document is more strategic than principles, but that's not going to be coming back to us. That's being delegated to the chair, the deputy chair and the like. And my real concern from what I've heard and the questions I've answered is much of the devil is in the detail. That has been obvious from the answers to the questions. And that is what is going to concern people out there. That is, what does this look like? How does it affect them? And certainly the comment that Councillor Watson made, that is signalled, that is more controls, higher prices, reduced supply, they are things that are of real concern. So while I'm familiar and comfortable to vote for A, I'm not going to vote for B because I believe that if there is significant detail, then we need to see that before we go out with it. Because I do not want to be associated with something that I'm not comfortable with, and I don't know what position other councillors take on that. And part of my concern, Mr. Chair, and it's reflected on the comments by a number of councillors, is that many Aucklanders are hurting. We've still got COVID and probably will have it for some time to come. There are many, many businesses that are borderline, that will be very dependent on people parking up and buying goods from them against a background where there's been a massive shift to online shopping. And at the same time, the government is imposing all sorts of changes on us that we have no control over, that will have a significant impact on parking, and perhaps very quickly in some areas against a background where we've got existing problems. So I have some very real concerns. Quite obviously, we have had some answers and some assurances, but I venture to say that none of us know what this parking discussion document is going to look like, and I think we should see it. So as much and all as it's not time for questions, there's still an outstanding question there. So at this point, I'll be voting for A, but not for B, unless there's a change there, because I'm not comfortable with B as it stands. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Walker. I will now take the comments of Councillor Collins. Councillor Collins.
Thank you, Chair, and I hope you can hear me all right. I was having trouble with my laptop, so I've come back on the phone.
You're clear.
Thank you very much. Chair, I won't be too long with my comments. I wanted to, I've enjoyed this discussion and the previous item as well, but I was starting to think of I'm not sure whether it was a planning workshop or meeting or a climate change committee workshop meeting. And there was a gentleman who'd come in with some paintings. And I remember the excitement in the room when people saw his paintings. And one of the questions asked of him was, are your paintings for sale? And I think he said yes. But the painting that I was thinking of as we had this discussion was where he had gardens or a lake down Queen Street. And the change that just that image brought for me and the kinds of ideas that it began to inspire in my mind. I've also been thinking about the time, I think it was our last planning meeting, that we had the Otara bike berm attend. And there was real excitement, I felt, in that meeting as they started to talk about how more and more of the young people, in particular of Otara, would use their bikes, would get on their bikes, cycle to school or cycle to and from work or other parts, if it was safe, if it was fun, and if it was possible. So I'd like to say that I want to endorse, I'll be voting in favour of this being considered by the public and us going out to consultation on these guiding principles. And I think that's what's really key here, is that they're guiding principles. We understand and acknowledge that Auckland is a very diverse city and that it's important that we bring everyone along. And I cheekily said to a journalist the other day that, from Manukau, it might be nice to kind of watch how it works with other parts. And I admit that that was a very cheeky statement, but sometimes I do wonder what happens out in kind of suburb areas like Manukau and not the same feelings for change happen in the central city. So I think this is a good opportunity for all of us to step back, to really consider what's going on and to hear what the community has to say. And Chair, I only said I wanted to make a comment because it was something you said in your, I think it was your opening statement, or just the statement you made before we went into general discussion about the opportunities that you had heard in the debates and through the questions, the things that might knock us back, the things that are going to be really hard. But you wanted to also hear about the opportunity perhaps for all of us to share this space. And I wonder, with the challenges that Aucklanders have felt, that we're finding it a little bit hard to share. I also reflected on when we went into lockdown the first time. And I remember how many of us in South Auckland and Manukau, in this ward in particular, started to reclaim the streets. And there were pedestrians all over the streets, and it was a tough time for many in the ward, and people would be waving out to each other. But more and more you started to see people enjoy the streets. I've tweeted about how there have been families who've said to me, if it feels good that, the kids feel a bit more confident riding their bikes now because the traffic has died down, and actually they can ride on the road sometimes, where many of the people I know in my area will never ride a bike on the road because it's just too dangerous. So that's the opportunity in front of us. And I understand it. I was hoping that Councillor Watson wouldn't raise it, but point 45 in the report gave me concern because there's a part in that report, in that portion of the report, that kind of rattles me a bit, and it's the bit around increased monitoring and enforcement. And for someone who comes from Manukau, that's always going to be difficult because many of our residents have always struggled whenever there's tickets being issued. There's always a feeling that it happens out here. And so I think we need to get the balance right. The challenge before my community is that we are car dependent. We have big families and we've got more than 2 or 3 cars that support our families, and more often than not, we're driving the gas guzzlers. We've got the big cars and we're perhaps subsidising, some of the activities going on in Auckland because we're paying so much petrol, and as a result of that, we're paying a lot of the proportion of the regional fuel tax. But this is an opportunity for all of us to participate in this discussion, and I think it's really important that we come on board, that Alpha and I make sure that people really participate in this conversation. So I'm going to be endorsing these particular recommendations in the hope that we do look for the opportunities, that we do step out and be bold, especially here in Manukau, to get out of our cars, to know that there are massive health benefits when we're much more involved in active forms of transport, and hopefully we'll be able to depend on a public transport system that we can trust, that is reliable, that's affordable, and ultimately, in my heart, that's free. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. Professor Collins, I'll now take the call of Councillor Bartley, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'm very happy to support this. I think, was it 2019 we declared the climate emergency for the city? Not so much of an emergency, is it, that it's taking us this long to address one of the major things regarding pollution and emissions. So, yeah, climate emergency, happy to support this. I think when it comes down to some of the things that's proposed, we're freaking out, which is regarding implementation, because we know some of the reaction that we're going to get back from our communities. That is where I think we need to do more work, and at least, we're recognizing that, because the issue I find with how things have been done in the past is you make these changes, these environmental changes, to make people do things. And then that's where there's this pushback. But what we've learned from the vaccinations is that you let the community lead. You bring the community in, you let them lead. It would be much easier for everyone because everybody agrees with the big picture that we need to do something about climate, which means we need to change our behaviours. So, yeah, I wouldn't want it to be a situation where we impose changes on people, because that is where you get people who fall through the gaps and who are affected disproportionately by it. And if we're always talking about equity, then maybe we know what those gaps are, and we need to address it now so that when these changes come through, everybody is on board and nobody gets left behind. So, yeah, that is what I want to say about this. Thank you.
And thank you, Councillor Bartley. I'll now go to Councillor Greg Sayers.
Through you, Mr. Chair, thank you very much. I want to start off by really congratulating the presentation from Auckland Transport. I thought Andrew did an outstanding job, and just want to recognise that, Andrew. Claire as well, and the whole team. Wonderful to have you along online as well too, Wayne. I understand that this is a consultation paper that's going out, and it's in early stages of development, but I do have some doubts about the direction setting suggestions that are in the paper. Particularly around some of the answers that were given by the officers to do with clause 28B, and really around the implementation that seems to be being signalled at the moment. And decisions should always be made locally with local inputs, as the locals know the areas the best. And by that I'm really meaning local boards with inputs or consultation with their ratepayers, particularly with regard to things like car parking. Also, ratepayers who pay our wages must remain empowered with a democratic right to be able to remove the people who make poor decisions or who, ratepayers don't believe are listening to them. So what I see is being proposed here is input from local boards, and therefore the ability for input from ratepayers is actually being removed. And Auckland Transport will be making decisions about car parks with reduced input from ratepayers. Certainly local boards, but I'm probably more wanting to emphasise a ratepayer. We are. I just wonder where family members are supposed to park when they go to visit somebody, or people needing to unload their groceries. Now that developers can build with no off-street parking, where are they going to charge their cars under this scenario? A vast majority of Aucklanders will continue to need cars and somewhere to park them. I just emphasise that. Where do they park? They need somewhere to park their cars. I also have concern around the negative impact that this proposed policy could have on town centres and shopping areas where, car parking is their livelihood. We've had, on one hand, we've got the national policy statement about, developers having option not to put in car parking. We've got consultation material in the public arena right now around freedom camping and wanting to open up our roads so they can park there. We've got, we're selling car parking buildings, but on the other hand, we're saying, let's remove some of the car parking around Auckland. So I just find that it's just a comment, Mr. Chair. It's a little bit ambiguous. The relying on developers to perhaps provide the car parking also found difficult to understand, or I think it's probably a bad assumption that developers will want to do that. Because who knows, they're going to make more money by putting in an extra bedroom than they are putting in a car park. So there might be, those financial benefits might well outweigh any others. And I did listen carefully to Auckland Transport's wishes to try and incentivise that to be the opposite way around, but I believe that's a big ask. So just to conclude, Mr. Chair, I guess this is a direction setting that will add chaos to Auckland streets and not some kind of intended utopia, because people need somewhere to park their cars, and accordingly, Mr. Chair, I'll just signal that I'll be voting against this motion because I can't endorse the paper and the direction setting. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Sayers. That draws us to the conclusion of the debate. The debate is closed and we will go to the vote. But before we go to the vote, I just want to say that the discussion document, we will pre-circulate it and members can make their comments back to the delegated members who will finalise the discussion document. So Councillor Walker had a concern about not being able to support B because the discussion document wasn't going to be seen. You'll have that opportunity, Councillor Walker, and it will be pre-circulated. Okay, now there's a call for a division. The division has been called for by Councillor Stewart. Members, just before I go to the division, can I recommend that if you would like to have your vote recorded against the part at the conclusion of the division, you let Kalinda, our governance advisor, know. So I will now hand to Kalinda to take the vote by division.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will wait for Sandra to bring that up. Okay. Councillor Darby.
4.
Councillor Bartley.
4.
Councillor Casey.
Yes.
Councillor Cashmore.
Aye.
Councillor Collins.
4.
Councillor Coombe.
Aye.
Councillor Cooper.
For.
Councillor Dalton.
For.
Councillor Filipina. Councillor Filipina, are you with us? Councillor Fletcher.
No.
Mayor Goff.
For.
Member Taipere. I believe Member Taipere's left the call. Is Councillor Henderson.
For.
Councillor Mulholland. Councillor Newman.
Yes, I'm for.
Councillor Sayers.
No, I'm against.
Councillor Simpson.
Against.
Councillor Stewart.
No.
Councillor Walker. I believe that our Councillor Filipina is back. So are you for or against, or do you abstain?
I am for.
Councillor Watson.
For.
Councillor Wilson. Sorry, Member Wilson. Councillor Young.
For.
Okay, and Councillor Walker, are you there? You regain connection? Okay.
Is that me?
Yes.
I said yes, 4.
Okay, thank you.
Obviously didn't hear.
Okay, so that is carried by 15 votes to 4, Chair.
Sorry, can we just check that number? I've got 14 to 4 on the screen. I think I just heard 15 to 4. Or did I miss it?
That's right, because Councillor Watson wasn't, Councillor Walker wasn't counted in the initial vote, but he has clarified that his vote was 4.
I can see it updated now. And members, if you want to record your vote against any particular part, if you could please make that clear to Clinton now. I'll just pause. They're being done. Thank you. Members, that concludes that item. Thank you. That's item 9. Members, let's take a 5-minute break and we'll come back in 5 minutes, please. So 5 minutes, say 10 minutes past 5, we will come back and reconvene this meeting. So stand adjourned until 10 past 5. Thank you.